Good morning, everyone. I think it's time for us to kick off. It's amazing to see people here who we're collaborating with and working with around the world. Welcome to our conference on loss and damage. See if I can work this. So, to all of our guests, ladies and gentlemen, students, collaborators, I wish you a warm welcome to Lund University. My name is Emily Boyd. And it's my privilege to welcome you here today on behalf of Lund and on behalf of LUCSUS and on behalf of the partners that are involved in organizing this first international conference on loss and damage. Many of you have traveled from far. That shows the value and the importance of this work, I think. And whilst we all also acknowledge the importance of flying less as academics, I think that if we have to choose the conferences that we attend wisely, I'm very happy that you've picked this conference wisely today. We're also grateful to Formas for supporting this conference with funding. We also have here today on our panel for the opening session, we have Koko Warner, who's from the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. I will say a little bit more about your bio in a minute. We have also Reinhard Mechler from IIASA here up front. We have Friederike Otto from Oxford. And we have Jonas Åkerman from Lund University, who are going to be giving you insightful talks and at the cutting edge of loss and damage from policy through to the science, and also taking us to the ground in Svalbard, where Jonas Åkerman has been working for the last 40 years. I'm just going to say briefly something about who we are at LUCSUS. We're an interdisciplinary research center that focuses on sustainability topics within the Faculty of Social Sciences. So we teach, we research, and we also engage with policy and society in trying to make our research relevant and applicable. So the purpose of the conference here, this is the first conference on loss and damage of this scale, I think, and I think it's also a very timely time that we created this conference. We're bringing together here multiple perspectives from researchers across disciplines, from economics, law, ecology, climate change, sustainability, humanities, finance and governance, with the idea that we can try and create some kind of a dialogue here around this issue of what we call loss and damage. And we're going to also discuss here what is loss and damage and what does it mean from these different perspectives. We have diverse science here, but we also can think about how the scientific discussions we have, the research discussions we have, feed into the policy, and how policy also sees the work that we're doing as relevant. Where can we hone in? Where can we crystallize the kind of questions that we're asking as researchers? We also hope to get out of this a special issue proceedings from the conference, and I was updated just now by Koko about the deadlines for the IPCC, and we need to be moving on with this as deadlines are coming in May in 2020 for submissions. But we're on board and we're excited about this, so we will make it. Opening session, so we have Koko, Reinhard and Freddie and Jonas who will be speaking next. Before we go over to them, I'm going to say a little bit more just about my perspective on loss and damage. Having been working on this for a few years, but clearly building on the work of people like Koko and Kes van der Ges at UNU, who set out this topic within the research community from the beginning. So in terms of defining loss and damage, contentious, but according to the UNFCCC, it's the actual and or potential manifestation of impacts associated with climate change in developing countries that negatively affect human and natural systems. This is obviously a picture of the kinds of events that we've seen unfolding over recent years, And it's with this type of unfolding that this becomes particularly pertinent to start asking these questions about the idea that adaptation perhaps isn't sufficient, the way we're engaging with tackling climate extremes in particular, leaves this question of what do we do with the residual risk? What do we do? Is there a limit to adaptation? How do societies actually prepare to transform under these types of extremes? Just to mention, the numbers of climate-related extremes have vastly grown. When I talk to my colleague, Freddie, climate scientist, she always explains to me that climate change manifests the increased likelihood, the increased frequency, and the social costs associated with climate change. So while disasters are not new, climate change is a magnifier of those consequences that we see. And that's very important. Loss and damage is something that is enshrined within the Paris Agreement, but there's been a long process of that occurring. As you can see, originally there were discussions about liability and compensation. We have colleagues here, such as Adele in the audience, who can talk more about this, how this comes to be from the perspective of small island states. But also, it's been a sort of social movement in a way. We talk about social movements these days. But it has become enshrined in the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, but there is no basis for liability or compensation. And we have Koko here who will talk more about the policy context of this. But just to give you an insight, there's a distinction between adaptation, as it's set out in policy, and loss and damage. Loss and damage, there is no compensation or finance. And that's an important point. That's been a really core discussion within the loss and damage debates. And still, there is also a lack of consistent definition around loss and damage. And you can see here a picture of negotiators deliberating around various texts, which we in our work have picked up on and tried to set out the different kinds of perspectives that there might be on loss and damage through interviewing experts, setting out an understanding of how far perspectives range from loss and damage as business as usual, it's about adaptation and mitigation, to those who perceive loss and damage to be something more of an existential perspective, that loss and damage is about irreversible losses. It's about a sort of transformation on a scale that needs to be compensated in some regards. So what we're seeing here in our work is there are these different perspectives, and those are important and relevant as to the actions and the kinds of research that you might engage with, and also the kinds of finance or the kinds of support that you might find within policy circles. So we identified in our work a range of research topics from these different perspectives. I've just highlighted this since we're here today to talk about research as well. And there are questions around whether we should be looking at climate change impacts and looking at understanding how those impacts affect adaptation and which ones are most relevant. There are those who think we should perhaps be looking more at understanding better a risk perspective and how we can form tools and approaches around a comprehensive risk as an entry point. There are those who think perhaps we should be looking at adaptation pathways and setting out what are limits to adaptation. And perhaps those who think we should be looking at places where vulnerable people are already exposed to the changes in climate where there is no return. So I'll give one example. Their colleagues in Australia, Karen McNamara, just got funding yesterday to do new work on looking at how loss and grievance is perceived in the Pacific region. And we'll set out a sort of 4-year research study on that. That would sort of fall maybe into that kind of type of research. So it's very exciting. I wanted to highlight the risk management perspective because that might be an area where one can find a sort of middle ground in a sense to be looking at the kinds of risk approaches or the comprehensive risk tools or assessments as a way, as colleagues, Aaron Roberts and Mark Pelling talk about as a kind of proactive approach to engaging with discussing loss and damage. So trying to push the discussion into thinking ahead about risks. And there we can look at the work from disaster risk reduction and disaster studies as a way to kind of perhaps preempt action rather than waiting for those losses to fall out down the road. Questions around adaptation limits. We have the work of Koko that we build on. Koko Warner did work across several countries in the Global South doing interviews and surveys together with Kees van der Gest, setting out ideas around the vulnerability aspect and the adaptation limits aspect to loss and damage. To what extent communities are able to adapt, but also where there are the lacking infrastructures or lacking support to communities to adapt. There are further questions to look at. We want to ask questions around what kinds of policy and legal frameworks are needed. We have Lisa van Halle here at the conference, who's been presenting the sort of latest thinking around governance and where the national perspective comes in and what kind of frameworks and approaches one can think about in terms of creating mechanisms. Is it that we're building mechanisms that already exist, such as disaster risk reduction mechanisms, or are there new types of adaptive or anticipatory governance mechanisms that we can feed into creating new loss and damage mechanisms? How feasible is that? Is that a real thing to be thinking about? How will insurance and economic instruments support loss and damage? We have a session on that here. The question there for me is, does loss and damage require additional funding? Who's going to provide that funding? Is it insurance or private sector? And according to sort of our perspectives where it's an issue that is beyond financing, is it not a matter of finance? Is loss and damage something that's a broader, let's say, part of a social movement or part of a societal discussion more broadly? Perhaps that's where it stops. And I know that there are colleagues here. We were having a brief chat before with some of the team here. We have Christian Laut in the back, who comes from the law faculty at Copenhagen, who's very keen to understand more about, where is this going in terms of policy, loss and damage? Where are the avenues for this? And to gain clarity on how loss and damage within policy is actually leading us somewhere and something that is necessary versus something that will stay where it is and not really evolve over time. Non-economic loss and damage. Can you put a price or measure losses? This is an important question we'll address in the humanities and gender session that we'll have here. I took a picture of a dragonfly here. This dragonfly has sort of cultural and symbolic meaning to people and communities in different places. So its symbolic meaning is apparently it's about transformation, adaptability, self-realization, which is really fascinating. There's a cultural element there. And why I use this example is just to show that if we lost this dragonfly or this species, would anybody care? Do we care? What is it about the attachment that we have with the fact that this has some kind of meaning? And I think we'll hear a bit about that from Jonas Åkerman in the panel session in terms of the changes that he's been seeing, observing in the landscape in Svalbard over the last 40 years in spaces where there maybe aren't so many people, but there is a natural environment that is changing or being lost. So it raises a question of who cares, why, and for whom do we care about these non-economic losses? And also, how do we measure? Do we need to measure them? Are there ways? There's work that's going on at Lund University under a project called DICE, which is looking at the disproportionate impacts of climate extremes. And in that project, amongst other, Chad Boda, who's going to be presenting tomorrow in the sustainability session, and Turaj Farhan, have been looking at ways in which Amartya Sen provides ideas on how you can measure capabilities. And maybe there are other ways that we can enter into looking at the notion of measuring non-economic losses and damages. So really interesting stuff. Then we see also broadly, if you look out the window around us, the responses to these extremes that we see occurring. This kind of thing, social mobilization. People are organizing themselves, and we have the question here, are these groups organizing themselves out in society in response to extreme events? Are they organizing themselves in response to the messages that are coming through around loss and damage? Oh, and I just skipped on to my next slide, which is, is this the next big thing in the context of loss and damage? This very fascinating modern science of attribution that Friederike Otto is going to talk us through next. So I wanted to now introduce our speakers, our honourable speakers here on the panel. We have Dr. Koko Warner, who's the head of the environmental migration, social vulnerability and adaptation section at UNU. And now she is working at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and leading on loss and damage within the policy circles, I would say. Koko has a long experience of this topic of loss and damage, and coming in it from a migration and environment perspective, and has really plowed the way for the rest of us, both through her research and through her policy engagement. She will be speaking to us next. We also have Reinhard Mechler. Reinhard has also been core to the discussions about loss and damage, has been really spearheading the topic with his book. I'm sure that was going to come up now through many of the talks here. But he has over 20 years of experience analyzing and addressing socioeconomic aspects of disaster and climate change. And he's really interested in providing evidence-based advice to a wide range of public and private sector decision makers to improve decisions and build resilience, which is really fascinating. So he bridges science and policy in fascinating ways. And he had a fascinating paper in Nature or Science on the comprehensive risk and transformations in the context of loss and damage, which has made a great contribution to him, to the field. We have Friederike Otto from Oxford. Everyone's sort of squirming when I'm saying how brilliant they are, but they are the forefront of this topic. She's acting director of the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, and has been really pushing forward ideas around this modern science of attribution, but also sort of critically engaging with the limits of this approach, and also asking questions around how do we incorporate vulnerability? How do we link to legal frameworks? How does this affect social change and social mobilization with a sort of reflexive and critical perspective as well, which is important. And then we have Jonas Åkerman, who's in the Department of Geography at Lund University. He's had a background working in Africa, and he's also been working in Svalbard for the past 40 years or so, really mapping out the changes through observations, like really good old-fashioned observation science. And he's got some really interesting insights and perspectives on what that means. And we thought it would be wonderful to have him end the session to bring us all back down to earth and ground us in those kinds of questions that I've raised here. Who are we governing, for what, why, and what does this all mean? So I think on that note, I will hand over to Koko, who's next. And I will bring up your presentation now, Koko. So if you'd like to come up.
Okay, just a test. Very good. I got it on. Good morning, everyone.
Brilliant.
Let me just get this set up so it doesn't fall. Should I start? Okay.
Unmute you, or you're unmuted.
Oh, I unmuted.
And here you go.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Emily, thank you for the generous introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers, Emily and your team, and Lennart at Lund, for bringing all of us here together. Of course, Richard and Rachel, and all of you from Oxford and the UK Met Service, Reinhard and your team from IIASA, partners who may not be here, but who have played an important role in our conversation over the years, Thomas Loster from Unicre Foundation and his team, and of course, ECOT. As Emily said, I'm coming from the policy space, the UNFCCC, and we see many of you at our meetings. You're known to us, and you're very important. Last week, we had the executive committee, our 10th meeting, and as some of you know, we'll have our Conference of the Parties in Santiago de Chile in the coming weeks, and it's a pretty important moment right now for loss and damage and for our international mechanism. It's called the Warsaw International Mechanism. I'll say a few words about that, but we talked about this conference, and we know you, or at least you're known to us, and your research and contributions make it quite important that you help us move forward in the work of the XCOM, so thank you for that. To get started, where are we right now? Countries actually don't care too much about climate change, obviously, or would be doing more. I don't say that in a flippant way, but what countries really want is they really want well-being for the people living in their country. So we talk a lot about sustainable development, and that's what countries make their decisions based on. They want a good life broadly for the people who live in their national boundaries. And science has a really important role to play. Science can provide the insights and is providing insights in all kinds of things, water management, health, etc. There's just to name one of or two of thousands. So science provides insights that help improve human welfare. Where does climate change feature? The adverse effects of climate change are getting in the way of sustainable development. And as we move forward and as we learn more about those profound impacts, it may be, I've heard in some meetings, that it could be, depending on how far we go with climate change and depending on our choices around mitigation, that sustainable development, as we think of it today, may be out of reach. That's a dramatic thing to say. But when we look at some of the literature that the IPCC special reports have assessed, you start having an emerging understanding of what will it mean to feed however many billions of people we will be in the coming decades? How will cities that are growing in coastal areas provide fresh water and services to people who are right now flocking to those areas for opportunities or for lack of opportunities in other areas? There are three levels that I wanted to mention where climate change and the adverse impacts can get in the way. Some of you know this. This is our kind of pretend landscape to help people start understanding what we're talking about when we think about adverse impacts of climate change. I'll say that phrase a lot. What's behind this is loss and damage. But in the policy space, we don't really, we need to further develop the concept of loss and damage. We have no definition, which you wouldn't expect coming out of a political discussion. So what we're talking about are a whole variety of interacting factors. So we have economic losses, non-economic losses. I'll just pick out a few to walk us through this. We have maybe losses of income, climate impacts, these adverse impacts if you are a small island state and you have a thriving tourism industry. People come to enjoy your beautiful coral reefs. Coral reefs are there's some of the biomes that are most acutely threatened by even relatively small changes in temperature. And we see that already. The special reports that have come out in the last year, 3 of them have repeatedly emphasized that coral reefs are imminently threatened by climate change and maybe irreversibly so. What would that mean if you have 70% of your national income coming in through tourism? What if so many people are engaged in tourism? What does that mean for you, and what do you do next? So these are some of the questions. In terms of non-economic losses, they may be even more profound, and we know perhaps even less about some of these. What about societal and cultural identity? Take your pick. There are all kinds of Biomes, for example, although I'm not from Germany, I live there. It's a forested country. Maybe this part of the world also, the biome is forest. What would happen if that biome changed, perhaps permanently, from a forest to a grassland? What would that mean for the cultural identities of the people who live there? Again, small island development states are often talked about and often kind of on the forefront of a lot of these discussions. What would it mean for you living in a low-lying island state, perhaps out in the Pacific, if your aquifer is polluted with salt water, perhaps permanently? What would that mean for you? Would it mean that you go somewhere else, or that you stay, but you stay in a whole new kind of way of living? So these physical and social impacts interact, and this is one of the big challenges. They often interact in ways that we're not yet prepared to think about. For example, 2 summers ago, all of the northern hemisphere, at least, pardon me, I'm often a little bit focused on the news that I'm reading where I live, but Germany had a very dry, very hot summer, and the Rhine, which flows about 1 kilometer from where I live, was so low that shipping was really impeded. And one of the impacts that was making the news was a very large chemical company upriver, so it was somewhere around Basel, wasn't able to deliver upstream. And that had impacts, of course, on the company. They had to cut production. It caused, what the company tried to do was to put their products on the roads. So that caused an increase, or it contributed to an increase in fuel prices, and it showed up in GDP and all of these things. Some of us hadn't been thinking of those adverse impacts of climate change. We often think of, oh, the river's low. And often your thoughts go to agriculture, but you don't necessarily think about shipping and other things. So we have a lot to learn about how all of these factors interact and what that means for our society. So there's physical and social disruption. Another impact that we have where we really need more research is decision-making under uncertainty. In our process, UNFCCC, and perhaps even more so at the national and subnational level, countries and other decision makers want to know, when do these XYZ changes happen? When in time? What does that mean for our election cycle? At what rate will these factors interact? For example, again, the Germany thing, because I live there. I'm, brushing my teeth in the morning, listening to the news. This summer, there was a report put out by essentially the German Federation of Foresters, and combinations of very heavy, extremely cold winters, dry summers, heat stress, have caused millions and millions of trees to either fall susceptible, they're sick, they're not doing well, and many, many trees are dying. And some are already asking, does this mean the biome is starting to collapse? What does that mean? And decision makers need to know, how do slow and extreme events interact? What's the rate of change? And what do they need to get prepared for? They need to know what to do. I may be kind of repeating myself on this, but next year at our COP, COP26, which will be in Glasgow, finance will be under discussion, among many other topics. If you were a country or a city or whatever other level of governance you are, what do you need to do, and what would you actually ask for? Asking for support for loss and damage is one thing. Asking for more specific things. Let's say you are a country, take any of them here. Let's say you've got salinization, land and forest degradation, and maybe, some cultural heritage. Combine those factors and talk to a finance institution and say, we need help to do XYZ in very specific terms. That's the direction we need to go when we're talking about support. To help avert, minimize, and address these adverse impacts. How do things get done? There's much more literature that we need from you as a research community that tells us what's been done, what's worked, what hasn't worked well. That how question is something that decision makers are asking. Who's involved? What do people think? What do they value? And where are these impacts occurring? one challenge that many of us struggle with is when we think about adverse impacts of climate change, the world of disaster risk management, we're building on their shoulders, and we understand disruptions often from the frame of something that's spatially and temporally specific. And a storm happening in my particular territory. But what happens if you're talking about aquifers, fresh water for coastal cities? What happens if an area upstream, maybe in a different municipality or even a different country, changes their forestry practices? And the forest that absorbs the water and lets the water go into your aquifer is now, that land is used for something else. Do we think about climate impacts in those terms? Where do the impacts occur? And what's the system and those systematic kind of interactions? That's all stuff that we need to know more about. And hopefully you as researchers can help us learn these things so that policymakers are more informed. And there will always be uncertainty, but more specificity is needed now more than ever. And maybe a final and very significant challenge that countries face as they try to provide a good life for the people that are living in their territories, and these climate impacts are unfolding, are values. Ultimately, climate change is a symptom of what we value. Everything, the life that we have around us is very fossil fuel intensive. Are there ways that we can think what we value and what makes a good life? That's one question. And another is about risk tolerance. I'll mention this again in just a minute, but what does society care about? And what are different societies willing to do? And when do those values change? What we're looking at with this kind of make-believe landscape is profound change. And that affects us. Most of us think about towards the end of our life. Some of us will think about, when I retire, I'm going to do this. Or for those of you who have kids, you imagine them growing up and getting an education and maybe having a life of their own. What will that future look like? It's just a few decades away. What would adverse impacts of climate change look like? What do you value? And what do we need to do together as society in order to keep that on the table? Well, so these are some of the challenges. UNFCCC understands these challenges on a day-to-day basis. We're working with national governments, and we have this policy cycle. So every 3 months, one or the other of our committees is meeting. My privilege is to work with a couple of those committees, one on local communities and indigenous people. Today, the one that we're talking about is the Executive Committee on Loss and Damage. And they meet, they prepare decisions, and then they meet in June and at the end of the year to make decisions. Just a quick word about the institution, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that has this executive committee. Many of you know it. Many of you know the people. The WIM was set up. WIM is Warsaw International Mechanism. The WIM was set up to help countries avert, minimize, and address these types of adverse impacts of climate change. And it's especially focused on vulnerable countries. And with the help of research, you play a very important role in the work that we do. That's the work that we're trying to do. The WIM is under review at COP25. And a review means you have a moment as observers, that's what you guys are all called, and as parties are countries, to evaluate what's gone well under this mechanism and how does it need to be enhanced in the future. And that will happen in just a few weeks. So keep an eye on this. If you have views, I'll give you some information about how you can express those views, but we're interested. So what could you do as research? Now I have two segments. I'm going to give you a plan, and then I'm going to ask you to do some stuff. So first of all, there are, I think I won't get to this. We'll do this in just a minute. So first of all, in terms of research, we're looking for research that will characterize what the adverse impacts of climate change look like in specificity. So we need specifics. We need more understanding about barriers to adaptation, what gets in the way. There's a lot of research at a very small scale, a lot of really great social science research. It's fantastic. We need more multidisciplinary research. We need, as always, scaled research. It's very good to have some global understanding, but the more that gets down to the area that links up with implementation, the more helpful that can be for policymakers. I know it's a big ask, but I'm just telling you what's necessary. We need a characterization of these interactions between adverse impacts of climate change. Because as you are writing your research, policymakers are making decisions, and it would be ideal if they could be informed by your research. A big area that's not in this kind of bucket of characterization, something that we do not yet understand, what happens when society starts changing its objectives. And you hear me making a little bit of a tip of the hat to chapter 16 from the 5th assessment report. It was a very nice kind of theoretical framework about the limits of adaptation. We need to understand better what happens when countries or municipalities or regions start changing their objectives, and what happens next, and what affects the choices that different decision makers make about, okay, maybe this sounds dramatic, but maybe food security all around the year is no longer possible. We need to understand more about those limits, if they are there, and what happens next. Do people switch crops and consume something different? Do they educate themselves differently and move somewhere else? We don't know. And hopefully you could help us with those kinds of questions. A second big area that is underserved so far in research, which would be really useful for policy, is to understand risk tolerance. When do climate impacts occur, at what rate, and what do people think about those? Some options to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage may be acceptable for some societies, and for others, not acceptable at all. We need to understand what people value and what's acceptable or not. And one of the reasons for that is in the international or national or municipal policy space, options on the table, if people don't accept them, you will get a growing kind of schism between what we're talking about in policy and what people are willing to accept. All over the world, you see youth on the streets, particularly youth, saying, hey, there's no planet B. I loved Emily, your slide. People need options that are both acceptable and not business as usual. Obviously, that's a really hard needle to thread, and so we need some ideas from research about risk tolerance. And the third is decision support. That research which helps us understand scenarios, what different futures could look like in some specificity, is very helpful. We need a new type. I'll take one example. In the IPCC, through the 5th assessment report, let's take the example of economics. Some of the literature that's been assessed has been environmental economics, which is often told the tale, climate change is bad and it will affect your GDP probably negatively. What would be increasingly helpful is a broader range of literature that helps us understand further dimensions of economics. What would adverse impacts of climate change mean for real estate markets, for a wide array of investments, for transactions, for finance, for people's livelihoods? GDP is something that's widely used. What additional literature could provide more information for decision support? And an end. And now the call for action. There are 3 things that you as researchers could consider in this conference and moving forward. And there'll be a lot to talk about here, but one is escape the constraints of today. If anything, research is about curiosity and imagination. We need to think about the frontiers of resilience. The Sustainable Development Goals are very worthy, there's no question. We're trying, good morning, we're trying to solve the problems of the 20th century by 2030. And they're very, very important issues to solve: poverty, hunger, water, life on land, life on the oceans, etc. Our world is changing so rapidly. What will things look like after 2020? And what kinds of milestones do we need to start reaching for now? And so I'd invite all of us to open your imaginations. It's easy for me to say. I know that you already are. But the more that we can think about the frontiers of resilience and not be constrained by the way things are currently organized, the more helpful that can be. A second area is to engage with major science policy processes. The IPCC is the really big one that's very important for UNFCCC. There are national assessments, etc. For the IPCC, keep your eye on, am I causing that? Okay, I'll go over here. Okay, so I'll stand here. It's also a little louder. The IPCC for Working Group 2 for the 6th assessment report has a review coming up. For those of you with interest in time, the reviewers play such an important role in pointing to literature that the authors may not yet have picked up. You might consider signing up to be a reviewer. Another thing, as Emily said, be aware of the IPCC. The different working groups have different timelines for submission. Your literature is so important. Everything that I just talked about, if you could publish all of that and submit it by next May, that would just be perfect. And then, so for Working Group 2, and Leonard and others, please correct me if you have additional information, but submitted journal articles, the deadline is the beginning of May next year, 2020, and then published, peer-reviewed and published, at least going to be published June 2021. And then the third, last one, we're almost done, is to engage with policy processes. You are all welcome in the UNFCCC. Many of you have personally spent many hours at our meetings, many days and even weeks. You're welcome, and you do make a difference. The conversations that you have with different representatives, bringing in your research, builds trust, and we need trust in order to pave the path together. So it's not just your ideas, but also your personal contribution is highly appreciated. We can have conversations afterwards about how you might get involved in the coming weeks, if you have time in the coming weeks. It's usually not too time intensive, but it does require engagement over, if you want to be effective, engagement over the years is great. So what does success look like in the end? If we could characterize the interacting adverse impacts of climate change, explore risk tolerance, provide research that is really helpful for decision support, you'll have informed policy. The uncertainty won't go away. It may grow, but you'll have policy that has a better chance of making changes. And what's really at stake are two things. For the scientific community, it's relevance. These changes out in the world are, in some cases, unfolding at a pace that's a bit surprising. You have countries moving their capitals. You have small island development states considering a revision of international maritime law so that the economic zones aren't defined by the national boundaries, which are defined by coasts, but by by the continental shelf. You have so many really significant changes. Those two were just announced in the past half year, and I could go on and on. We're talking openly about population retreat in the country that I'm from. We're revising regional water laws, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things could be better with your contribution. And that's also said in humility because you're already contributing so much. But what success looks like is more specifics. If you're talking about finance under the UNFCCC, it's the difference from something that's kind of general, like we need support, to something that's more specific and maybe more constructive. And what failure would look like is that science doesn't play a role in helping inform policy. Policy is going to have to make decisions, be it in the next few weeks or in the coming years, and you have a role to play in that. So in conclusion, we will, through this conference and through continuing engagement together, move from a cautionary tale to informed choices and pathways. We'll move from general to specific. We'll move from trauma to transformation, from knowledge to action, from work that is blind about values to work that is informed about what people care about. And really difficult, and this is all very difficult, but we'll move from resistance to change to helping to really build the future, as difficult as it will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Koko. We actually have some time for questions, and it's a great opportunity for Q&A from the audience. If you have specific questions to Koko on the policy context. Yeah, Rachel, at the back.
Thank you. It's on? Thank you, Koko. That was brilliant. Good call to action. You talked a lot about specificity, which I found really useful, but also quite challenging from a scientific perspective. And in particular, you said that it would be useful to characterize the impacts of climate change, what they look like in specificity. And I think a lot of my work on looking at, for example, changes in African rainfall and the associated impacts with that, there's so much associated uncertainty, and I'm wondering a bit more about what would be useful, how we can go from wide ranges of what might happen towards something more specific. And there's been some recent work around scenarios and storylines for communicating about climate change uncertainty. And do you think if we were to develop storylines of kind of hypothetical loss and damage, is that useful if it's more specific but without an associated probability, for example? Is that still useful?
Yes. In policy, some of you have been involved in creating the shared socioeconomic pathways literature. And these aren't necessarily yet buoyed up by modeling and evidence, and yet they're very, very useful. So when I talk about specifics, it may be that if you're writing a journal article, perhaps in the discussion, you can bring out some of these issues. You can't cover everything all at once. I recognize that. But literature that's more specific, either tagging things in abstracts or in the discussion section, do your research, of course, but then bring out additional things. What happens in the policy process is it is both evidence and modeling as well as imagination. And so, for example, typical questions that we hear from countries are about timing, where these things happen, how the level of severity, and those may be things that a particular, like your research, for example, Rachel, those may be things that for a particular research publication you may not have answers to, but you can discuss those in your discussion. And it's not me to tell you the details of your research, but more specificity, be that about geographies, timescales, factors that matter, sectors that matter, are helpful for the negotiators as well as their groups and countries.
Yes, Chad, the front.
Thank you. Thank you, Koko, very much for the talk. I wanted to ask your perspective on what you see as the major challenge of achieving what I saw as kind of the core of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and that's to find this coherent, integrative, and comprehensive approach to loss and damage. I think a lot of loss and damage research deals with these dichotomies between economic, non-economic, et cetera, as you talked about. So from your perspective, what do you see as one of the major challenges for achieving that core ambition of the Warsaw International Mechanism?
There are at least 3 challenges. I'll just mention 3 that come to mind, but we could talk exactly about your question for a long, long time. What I've put up here is the purpose of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and then it has this executive committee that I told you about, but it has 3 functions. Overall, the purpose of this international mechanism is to help countries avert, minimize, and address the adverse impacts of climate change. And what we're talking about with these adverse impacts is really, in addition to all of the preemptive adaptation planning and implementation that is taking place in the world. So there are 3 functions. One is enhancing understanding and knowledge. One is strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence, you mentioned that. And then enhancing action and support. For all of these functions, the greatest amount of work, ironically, because I get to be with you this week, the greatest amount of work is enhancing knowledge and understanding about what these things mean. And even there, you see how much more we have to learn. So there's a lot to be done. In terms of challenges, I'll mention 3. One is conceptual. One is about actors, and one is about architecture. So conceptually, I'll give an example. Yesterday, as part of our work, we have a workshop going on in Bonn today and yesterday about comprehensive risk management and data and risk assessment and systematic observation. And so it's a mixed crew, and there was a spectrum of perspectives. I was there yesterday, so it's going on today. So obviously it's a little narrow what I'm telling you, but there's one group especially from the contemporary disaster risk management community that's looking at risks in a spatially and geographically defined way. So you have risks to people and ecosystems in specific times and places. And then there's another spectrum that's almost what you were mentioning, Emily, almost existential, looking at just profound change. And do we think about profound change, systemic change that's not necessarily reversible? You're going from one state to another. Is that risk anymore, or is it something different? So we have conceptual challenges. And so when you're trying to create international policy about something that it's like wildly different perspectives, that's a big challenge. And that's a big challenge for getting coherence in policy. Another challenge are the actors. All of our institutions, be it nation states to your National Disaster Risk Management Authority or mayors, we're all organized according to the world as we know it. And all of us in our different roles, we're doing our jobs on a day-to-day basis for contemporary issues. And actually, a lot of our organizations were created and they were geared towards 20th century challenges. They haven't yet caught up to the kinds of emerging risks and issues that we're dealing with right now, are contemporary in the 21st century, let alone in the future. So agencies in the United Nations, I'll just take that because that's the family that I belong to, we're all looking for resources to do our work. Development cooperation and climate change and environment, et cetera. And we don't always have the same mandates, and we're trying to approach, let's say, sources of support to do the job that we're supposed to do today. And that sometimes gets in the way of coherence because we're trying to do different things. And then a third is architecture. An example that I will mention is cities. Cities, let's take a large mega city. Let's say in some coastal area in Asia. People are flocking towards urban areas like these for lack of opportunity in other places, for education, jobs, et cetera. And some of those areas are increasingly exposed to climate disruptions, be they extreme events related to climate or other kind of interactions. So all of the architecture that UNFCCC is dealing with is about nation states. Cities are municipal and they're underneath a nation-state apparatus, but they have their decision-making, they have their pressures, they've got to build infrastructure, they've got to mitigate. And our current architecture doesn't necessarily link up the policy processes and where action needs to occur. That's just one of a whole number of challenges. So we have conceptual challenges, actor challenges, and architecture challenges. The architecture that we need in the future, which is why, by the way, I invited all of us to free ourselves from the constraints of current thinking, is because some years down the road, and it may not be very long, 5, 10 years, the pressures that we're facing as a society are going to need kind of new ways of conceptualizing, potentially new actors or new combinations of actors. One wonderful thing, the promise of multidisciplinarity, is it helps us already start planting those seeds, and we'll most likely need additional or new architectures to deal with all of these interacting things. And I'm interested in your thoughts, even though I just talked so much.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. I have a quick one. Can I take it? Well, I have lots of questions, and we're going to have these 3 days to talk to you and talk to each other and really push these topics that you've brought up here. And I mean, I have questions around how, in the policy context, does the executive committee and loss and damage sit in relation to adaptation and mitigation? Is it an arena that people are seeing seriously as a third pillar of the negotiations as we talk about it in the research? Is that the case? And also questions around this fascinating interaction between research and science that you bring up, and this tension almost between freeing ourselves from the constraints to do the kinds of blue skies work, either within our disciplines or interdisciplinary, but also being aware of the policy context, the kinds of questions that policy needs to have addressed, and so on. And perhaps these are more topics that we can discuss as we go along, and perhaps come back to at the end of the conference as well, to see whether the science that we're talking about here is the stuff that is useful, but also unconstrained enough to come up with new ideas that can help the policy process also move things forward. Yeah.
I would just comment on a timeline. If all of you could draw a timeline in your mind from today out until approximately 2023. It should go way, way farther. But in terms of the UNFCCC process, there are different questions. We have this policy cycle, and I wouldn't constrain you as researchers to only do research for our cycle, but if you're publishing anyway, and you want to bring in your findings at particular points, timing is everything. So what you could do is think about what you want to contribute to out in the world. This is so naive. I beg your pardon for telling you this, because you know it. You're like, we're following you. But there is a timeline. So for example, 2023 is our first global stock take after the Paris Agreement, which was way back over there. So this will be a time when most of the work streams, loss and damage, has been added by least developed countries. How are we doing with the goals of the Paris Agreement? And what would it need to look like? So between now and 2023, what kinds of contributions could you make from a research perspective that would help start answering some of those questions? And we're getting, as we go along, we're getting a better idea of the kinds of things that countries are already asking for that period. That stock take, by the way, goes every 5 years. So that's a whole cycle. Next year, 2020, the Conference of the Parties will meet in, I hope it's public because I've already said where it's going to be. But in 2020, one of the big topics will be finance. And where are we? One of the questions for us is, what would finance actually need to look like to help countries avert, minimize, and address? So you could basically just think of a timeline and anticipate, or we could chat about the kinds of questions that we're hearing countries ask. And again, in the UNFCCC, our main clients are countries, but there are additional really important stakeholders.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Koko. Another round of applause. Okay. Now we have Reinhard.
Yep.
There we go. Brilliant.
Yeah, great.
Over to you.
Good morning. Great inspirational talk by Koko. So it will be great to build on this. We didn't coordinate at all, but the comments I wanted to make will go in a similar direction. Before starting off, and I have a few more slides to show than Koko, sorry for that. I would also like to thank the hosts and the conference organizers for getting us together. It's really important that we do this community building. Think about research, but also how research informs policy and practice. How do we work together? And we're all part of the debate. It's not that we're only researchers. We also have this other thing. We're part of social movements. We also have this intrinsic motivation. So it's great. Thanks, Emily, also for the kind words in the beginning. And I look forward to meeting old friends and new friends over the next 3 days. So quite excited to being here. There it is. Koko had a call for action to research. What do we need and what would success look like in a few years' time? And I think I also would like to go in that direction. I wanted to present a bit of ideas or a bit of tour de table. What has research been doing on loss and damage, which is of course political debate. What has research been doing to inform this debate? And how is research also working with practice to take this stuff forward? I want to organize my talk around some propositions, provide some examples, and then end also with that big question: why are we here? What's in it for us? Where do we want to take stuff to? My comments go in a similar direction, as I mentioned, to Koko's comments. We didn't coordinate at all, so it's a bit, maybe it's coincidental, but maybe it's just in the air, so that's what it is. Let me just start off showing something that you're all aware of, but I want to mention it again. So loss and damage is political debate. I'll come in a second to what the substance behind that is, but science has worked, of course, on making substance contributions to that. Loss and damage is political debate. It's quite old political debate. It started more than about 3 decades back. It's taken forever to be institutionalized under the UNFCCC. Warsaw is now 7 years back. I talked to some colleagues in the morning. Wow, 7 years. It's a long time. And to be honest, Koko also having to be political here, but also indicated more is needed to propel this debate forward. And that's, I guess, also what we are sharing here. We had Paris, we had the Paris Agreement. That's good and nice. We got expert groups that work with policymakers, but still the policy space is quite contested. We still don't know what the mechanism is, what should be done, what are policy options on the table, what can be taken forward. It's still the space is a bit contested in a good sense. I think that negotiators are talking to each other, but still the fundamental demands have probably stayed a little bit where they were 7 years back, or maybe even 30 years back, which needs attention. So it's about addressing, it's really addressing loss and damage. So these are the demands for some sort, let's say it outright here, for compensation for what has been lost. It's also about averting and minimizing future risk. So it's about offering. So there's demands, they're being a bit rejected. There's offers on the table for risk management and insurance. How can this be brought together? It's timely also, because at COP25 in Santiago, the Warsaw mechanism will be reviewed. And I hope we can also have a chat here with Koko and others what that review is, because we all have some ideas about this and what can be done. So debate is really old. It's ever more relevant. That was also mentioned by Emily. Has to do with Sweden, has to do with all of us. So we got the FFF movement, Greta stepping into the picture, Greta Thunberg, right? So that's how I pronounce it. My kids also in the street, I also follow along. It just shows, there's additional need to think about how it's framed in the FFF and the Extinction Rebellion movements, about the existential element of what climate change is leading to. And as Greta also says, she is always building on the science evidence. She's just saying, well, you guys, IPCC, other researchers, you publish this stuff. You say that's real, right? And policymakers accept it at the IPCC, at the plenary approval sessions. Why is it not being acted upon? And that's a good and valid question. We have been asking this question also, but now there's some movement behind it, which I find really stimulating and exciting, also really challenging. Also these challenges, also the narrative of existential impacts has also been picked up at UN levels, which is a bit novel. Has been there, but now it's quite novel. UN Secretary General also at the UN summit talked about the fate of humankind depends on how we address climate change. So there's something novel here to what loss and damage debate started out on 3 decades back. So how can science inform that? And here's a busy chart. On the upper part, it shows the movement forward on the loss on the political debate. And the bottom chart is like a promotional figure by the IPCC suggesting there's an upward propelling movement. And we have a co-chair, actually, no, vice chair, right? Vice chair from the IPCC here, Jan Fuglestedt from Norway, basically suggesting IPCC reports, which are building, of course, on community efforts, have been quite influential in shaping policy debate on 2 degrees, on the Paris Agreement, and the global stocktake. I think certainly there's a truth about it, but I'm also with bias, and I'm also involved in the IPCC, as many of you are. Yeah, so the question is there actually science to loss and damage? Maybe a few years back, people were not so clear, but us being gathered here, and also work in increasing number of publications, I think really show there is a science basis emerging around key topics and disciplines. Here I just mention a few topics like attribution. We'll hear from Friederike Otto, one of the lead persons in that field later on. It's a lot about risk assessment, risk analysis, insurance. There's also good insight here from research and practice. Limits to adaptation come in. The non-economic losses and damages are dear to the debate. They're also seeing increasing attention, and that's really important. It's also about profound change, as Koko indicated. It's about transformation. What can we say here? And then about displacement, migration, and all kinds of other things. I think so. There are, summarizing this, there are certain lines of research for policy and for practice purposes that are seeing attention. And all of us and many of us here are working on those issues. And I think the science basis is getting increasingly solid, but more is needed. Being invited here to give that keynote, thanks Emily for having me. I wanted to be friendly and kind and also build on the perspectives paper. And here's actually I really like this chart because it's visual, right? Suggesting there may be, I think, 3 key areas that loss and damage is about. The first area, adaptation mitigation, is nothing special to climate change. As also Emily, Richard, Rachel, Freddie, and Hannah were saying in their paper. I think what's different is the risk part, the limits part, the existential part. In my words, in my discussion, I wanted to build on that, but I wanted to also add this additional item. So I think over the last 2 or 3 years since this was published and actually research done with negotiators, with researchers, with practitioners, I think the transformation debate has really also permeated the field. So I think that's a bit novel and needs attention. It's also linking across these spheres, these balloons or circles. So I have a few propositions. What is that? So that's basically summarizing a little bit what's happening in the field in a non-exclusive fashion. It's just my perspective. And I will be biased also by looking into risk analytics, to be honest. But I want to highlight a little bit what's happening and how this can and is actually making a difference and what additionally can we do in the field. Hopefully this provides food for thought for today or whatever. And yeah, I just want to present that a little bit. I got 4 of these propositions. So the number 1 is the attribution part, and Freddie will build on that, and she had a quick comment to me already, so that I may not fully get it right, but Freddie can talk about that in a second. Attribution, of course, is a conditio sine qua non, so can we identify a climate change component on hazards, on impacts, on risks, and how can we identify that at high levels of confidence? So that's more the technical part. There's also this broader science part to that. The science has been associated with blaming and responsibility only, but it can also be an important input to informing risk thinking by looking into many drivers, not only the climate-related ones, but also the socioeconomic drivers. And the attribution field, event attribution, impact attribution, even risk attribution, is going forward quickly and is seeing a lot of attention, is really important. So here, attribution, lots happening, and it has a broadened role. Here, a few quick slides, which are a bit futile, because Friederike Otto will go into that in a second. Here, just a quick overview slide. There's this loss and damage circle in the middle. That is actually where we are asking this question, okay, how emissions and concentrations changing climate and weather, and also the ocean, the cryosphere, the biosphere, but what are these socioeconomic drivers? Land use change is fundamentally important. What are human influences, exposure and vulnerability also coming in? So it's about broad-based attribution of many drivers that affect losses and damages, climate impacts, climate risks. This chart, I think Freddie has a comment later on. This chart was just supposed to show there's different lines of work on attribution. It's about event type attribution, so the types of events that are going forward. That's on the x-axis. So are extremes, extreme colds, extreme heat waves, droughts, or cyclones. How are they proceeding under climate change? What can we say generally about trends here with regard to those hazards? And you see on the x-axis, there's from low to high. That means confidence. So there's higher confidence in the field that cold waves and heat waves and droughts, etc., can be attributed to climate change. With sudden onset events, it's much more complicated because just the database, the observations are just more limited. On the y-axis, and that's just supposed to be just providing a bit of food for thought for the debate, and of course I'm not an attribution expert. On the y-axis, however, it's about specific event attribution. And here also the field has gone forward, thinking about droughts in the Sahel or Cape Town drought. How can this be linked to climate change, and what can we say about this? The confidence level, as you see through the circles sitting on the right-hand side of the 45-degree line, the confidence levels for specific attribution is more limited because, again, less observations. It's much more tricky to think about event attribution. Of course, I'm just speaking to the converted here because you may not know much more about attribution than I do, but it's an important field. There's also impact attribution. So what are the impacts in terms of loss of glaciers, loss of subsurface ice, but also area, plant, and animal species loss of ecosystems and biodiversity. So what can impact attribution say here? Without going to detail here, it can say a lot about impacts in physical and biological systems. In the human systems, which is very important for the loss and damage debate, it's more complicated because we got even more drivers that are affecting impacts and risks. So this is just a summary slide by Christian Hugel and colleagues, and I just wanted to bring that into the discussion and leave it at that, at the technical levels. But what can this be used for? So it certainly, as also indicated in the beginning, it's about the responsibility question for today and the future. We got some philosophers in the room, some people working on ethics, and it's about justice. It's about, let's call it this way, compensatory justice. So who's responsible for what has been lost? What actions are to take? Do we need to support, fund, whatever? It's also about distributive justice, and some of us, including Ivo Wallimann and Tomasz Schinko and Olivia Sadeczny sitting in the room, think it's also about distributive justice, thinking ahead who should take risk management actions for averting and minimizing future risks that are affecting people and ecosystems. That's one. So attribution is important here. Also attribution important for the legal perspective. So court cases have been taken forward, as you see also in the brochure of the conference, the Suarez case that you're well aware of. What can be said here? So here the question is exactly about confidence. And so quite often there's lack of high confidence for impacts in social systems, which this Suarez case is somewhat about. In recent publications, some people were suggesting, it's important, but I think also at lower levels of confidence, can we not think about probabilistic causation? So the dice is being shaped. There's increased intensity that this glacial lake that Sol Jura has been taken to German courts, that there's increased probability that there will be a glacial lake outburst, flood, that will affect people downstream. Can we not frame it around like tobacco cases that have seen light and success in the US courts? Can we not frame it around this, and can attribution be important here? So quite some movement going forward here, attribution being important for this question about multiple causation and probabilistic causation. Just bringing that in. I'm going a little bit into the climate risk perspective already. I wanted to highlight this a bit more with a second proposition. As I think, and as also mentioned by Koko and Emily, climate risk analysis is providing for a useful entry point to the debate. We've seen that many times, IPCC propeller diagram, which is like saying it's multiple drivers causing risk, being behind risk causation. The risk language is also important to think about aligning timescales, geographical and temporal timescales for sudden and slow onset events. It's not only about sudden onset events, heavy rain or cyclones, it's also about, this glacial lake outburst, floods or droughts and so on. Taking a broad-based risk perspective, even thinking probabilistically, we can go across the whole spectrum. And the slow onset events are very important for the loss and damage debate. It cannot only be about sudden onset events. So it helps with providing a joint lens on that, which is shown here. Risk is also important to think about about this averting, minimizing, and addressing. For me, it's a lot about avoided, unavoided, and unavoidable, what Roda Verheyen and colleagues framed the other day. Here you see a few bars that show past, current, and future risk in terms of total risk, and the green part being the part that can be and has been reduced. The red part being that part of risk which can never be reduced, because there's always a residual risk that remains in the past, in the current period, and the future period. The red part, the orange part is what the residual risk is. The red part is basically what's coming into climate change, and that's just in a stylized fashion, and that's expanding over time, as we could say in a stylized fashion. What loss and damage is about, some would argue, it's about the unavoided part, so the stuff that is unavoided, and the stuff that is unavoidable, and where climate change is having an impact. And so that's also a way to frame it around the broad risk perspective. Understanding residual risks has always been there. What are these elements of residual risk that need attention and are maybe unavoidable or can be further reduced by taking risk management actions? Number 3 would be to think about the limits of adaptation and existential risk, as we have also seen it in the work by Emily Boyd and colleagues. I brought this together because for me that's really dear and it's linked. Over the last few years, researchers have made quite some progress, I guess, on identifying what these hard limits, irreversible impacts, mostly in natural systems, may mean, and what these social limits, the soft limits in social system may mean. Some of us have worked on this limits table that popped up in the 1.5 report. Talking to negotiators, they don't see it. They have not seen that, which is a little bit surprising to me. We as researchers have been quite excited in producing here evidence that we're seeing hard limits with regard to coral reefs, so tropical coral reefs. There's a high chance that those will be lost even at 1.5 degrees warming. 90% of those will be lost, at the 1.5 report said. At 2 degrees of warming, there will be all of it will be lost, actually. There's some evidence on this one. So this is really unfortunate news, and which some of us put together. So Rachel was also heavily involved here, and some of us, Adele and others. There's also evidence about biodiversity and human health, coastal livelihoods, and also smaller impacts on small islands. Some of these limits are more soft, they're more socially driven and constituted, and it's harder to, as we also could not fully identify, is it really like a soft or hard limit? So there's more work to be done. In the IPCC a year back, we brought it in and it was accepted. It was not taken out by, if countries that are sitting in the plenary approval sessions, if they have a hard time with that, stuff like this would be needed to be taken out, but it wasn't. It's there. There's much more work to be done. Unfortunately, it's not recognized with the negotiators. Talking to those, they don't know that there's something in Chapter 5 of the IPCC report, which says something about how do we communicate, how do we take it forward a little bit more in the future. What's important is we need more evidence on losses and damage, particularly in the non-economic losses and damage, so that IPCC can report on it, that they can think about the soft and the hard limits. Petra Chakert and colleagues, and Petra's not in the room, but I think she'll pop up in the conference, yeah. She has done excellent work on looking back into 100 and more studies to think about what are the non-economic losses here in non-indigenous and indigenous populations. Think about what is damaged, so what can be reconstituted, or what has been lost for good. And this is really an important paper she and others brought out in 2019. For example, providing good evidence that there's impacts, losses and damages with regard to culture, lifestyle, traditions and heritage. And these items, excuse me, are dear and important and pop up all the time in the negotiations around the WIM in Bonn. These are really important pieces of the discussion, in addition to losses of assets and economic losses. It's great to have further information here, and we really need to work on that a bit more. Brings me to my fourth proposition, and maybe I quickly run through that. I have too many slides, as you can see. But the key question, I guess, we're also like going into also that what Koko asked, can we find some sort of consensus? Is there any like common platform? Can we think about joint definitions? Can we think about a policy space? Where we are a bit more clearer about what loss and damage should tackle at national to international levels. I think the transformation debate has a role to play here. I don't have time to go lots into transformation, but I wanted to say we can approach it more like negatively. There's good evidence to suggest that with at higher levels of warming, the standard approaches, dams and dikes, may not be enough. Something else may be needed to, for example, avoid forced migration. So that can mean switches of livelihoods for farmers in India and things like that. So there's debate. It's a bit fuzzy and unclear, but it needs more attention. It's certainly popped up in the IPCC, but also in negotiations and in this expert group on risk management in Bonn. Question is then how to analyze this and what to do about this. I have a few comments on that. And I think that's also food for future thought. That's also what Koko talked about. How do we think about risk tolerance? How do we bring this home? What are methods here? Quickly, a quick example only of work Tomashenko and myself and others have done, building on IPCC key risk language and analytics, and work around the UNF triple stock take on 2 degrees, on the 2-degree target, building on literature review, building on expert judgment, which we're quite frequently using for work here, which is necessary and so on. Quick example here, here's a global map of impacts at confidence levels globally coming out of the IPCC, you may have seen that. A key focus of the loss and damage debate are small islands, where we see important impacts playing out over time. And this has been summarized in the key risk language by the IPCC in terms of information around 4 timelines, present, near term, 2 degrees and 4 degrees. So showing a way how does risk play out over time. Some of us, Thomas and I, have taken that forward to think about this question, okay, what's high levels of risk, but also what's dear to people, what's risk tolerance, what's risk intolerance, and things like that. Going into that space where future actions cannot be taken, where more support is needed. So we turned the scale around, so that was the simple part. Then we thought about this coloring, coming out also of the chapter 16 by Klein et al. In the AR5 to think about risk evaluation and risk tolerance, and basically put this in like this a little bit. Think about basically risk in the past, so that's a gray bar. Then the additional element, so this is basically sea level rise, sea surge and stuff. The black part is what's coming in additionally to climate change. And then the outer part of this risk bar is showing total risk as summarized for the whole group of small islands, which are Caribbean and Pacific islands in the IPCC. And the bar, however, would show this whole box, this striped box would show actually additional actions to be taken to reduce risk from the upper part of the box to the lower part, with standard disaster risk reduction actions on seawalls, early warning insurance, and on some adaptation actions. That's the other part of the blue, so maintenance and restoration of coastal landforts and stuff like this. This is other elements, and that exactly goes into this transformation space, suggesting we need something else already at this level of tolerance, as we indicated. And people in small islands, and we have real experts here in the room. I've never been to the Pacific small islands, I've just been to the Caribbean small islands. But based on survey information, there's good information to suggest that voluntary resettlement is certainly on the screen of decision makers and stakeholders. It's also about switching livelihoods if you cannot grow your vegetables in some of the islands due to increasing salinization. What can be done here to provide a basis for subsistence? So that's how we played it out, visualized it, And then we thought about 2 lines of actions to be taken, actually 3 lines of action. The black line of action would be this curative part. That's basically saying compensation, right? Those places have seen increasing levels of sea level rise. You got embankments in those places. Those embankments need to be strengthened. That costs money. Here's a way to ask for additional support so that further protection can be provided over time. So it's a euphemism, but it's also like thinking about providing a cure for a problem that has arisen. The blue part is doing standard DRR and climate change adaptation. And the white part is this transformational space. It remains a bit fuzzy, but what we are suggesting, there's additional item that needs attention, and can this be serviced and supported under the loss and damage, but also adaptation debates. As stuff is playing out like this as we graphed it out, and that's of course building on expert judgment and quite a few assumptions. And that needs, we can certainly debate this over the next few days. But here's a language and like analytics that may help us to go into this transformation space. That's the bottom line of it. We were quite excited about it. We also discussed it with negotiators, and they said, well, yeah, okay, nice, and so on. So it's not that this is being picked up right away, so it needs more attention. It's a bit of a research agenda. The research behind it needs more work. Others have picked it up. There's John Hentman and Johanna Nalau. They looked into Vanuatu and other places. And also, like what I wanted to shortly introduce is this idea about risk tolerance has also been taken forward by some donors and development assistance specialists like GIZ, for example, that have a loss and damage unit that builds their efforts around a comprehensive risk management approach, which you can see outlined. It's about climate risk assessment. It's about comprehensive risk management measures. Some of these are mentioned. Then it's about decision support and implementation. For that, this didn't work, this slide, so let me skip over that. I want to very shortly, and then I'll go to my summary, 1 or 2 summary comments. I want to say here, the work we have done behind our desks, we're sitting in Vienna, building on IPCC work. This desktop work has been taken to the field, to Tamil Nadu, some villages, coastal villages, so these are farmers close to the sea, like growing rice and paddy field, like they have paddy, and so they're being affected by cyclones, by salinization, sea level rise. What can be said here? What actions can be taken? What's the state of the art with regard to this local level, at community level impacts? What can be done here, and what can be done taking methods forward? And I really only very shortly introduce this. Here household surveys have been done, risk-risk comparisons have been taken forward. Then risk responses have been categorized. And again, expert judgment has been used, and we were also involved in this line of work. I don't go into detail here. If you want to find out what's dear to people locally, to stakeholders, and 1 minute is okay, thanks, then you need to really engage, and that happened in this project with surveys asking about climate-related risks, but also asking about idiosyncratic risks like health, price shocks, and other kinds of risks. This you can then play out on a color scale, and you can compare them. You can do risk comparisons to understand what's climate and what's non-climate related risks. The message here is climate-related risks are important. And then you can play it out also on a scale from incremental to transformational, and the in-between really being important. Hope we can discuss this further in the conference. Here come my last 2 slides. What's next? Research gaps. Certainly, I think we want to think more about the limits, the soft limits. What is it? Or is it more frontiers rather than fixed limits? What can we do here as researchers? We need more evidence of non-economic losses and damages. This risk tolerance I went into needs more attention methodologically and also like empirically at the right scale of risk management. Transformation is another buzzword, but it's certainly a buzzword we need to attend to and address more in the future. Finance is important. Koko went into that. What are finance options for supporting those that are facing the heat, additional rainfall, and rising sea levels? It's my last slide, my really last slide. where is it all taking us? So when I came here, I thought about, okay, why are we here? What are we doing? I think we want to inform mitigation and adaptation broadly with the work we're doing. The work we're doing can act like a canary in the coal mine to finally support the ultimate ambition to go to 1.5 degrees of warming, which is really, really difficult, as we know. Loss and damage also has to focus on the most vulnerable. That's quite often forgotten in adaptation debates. I think that's a very important part of the debate and of the work we're doing. Ambition would be working towards something, a joint definition, a joint policy space. Can transformation and thinking about this help? Can we also think about this addressing part, the curative element, the compensation element? Yes, can we work towards identifying what this loss and damage mechanism, what the Warsaw mechanism is about? Can we provide some beef behind this with regard to financing and national to local action? I think we can go forward, and there's good opportunities here. For example, as Koko also alluded to, there's expert groups under the WIM constituted on economic loss, non-economic losses, low onset events, risk management, and displacement. And then there's also opportunities to exchange with practice and work with practitioners on the ground. I see them increasingly flocking into the discussion, and they also see a need to responding to what people at the front line of climate change hold dear and where they want to see additional actions being implemented. So yeah, busy slide set. Hope people that know me know that I'm a busy slide guy, but I hope there's a bit of food for thought and that we can discuss this further now and later. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So I might just allow for one question since we're running a little bit over. But otherwise, we can also come back, hold your question till the end to the space that we have for some Q&A. Anyone pressing right now? No? Should we move on then? So thank you, Reinhard.
Okay, good.
Brilliant.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Sit here.
So you need to do. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's better. Okay, so I will provide quite a different perspective on loss and damage. Actually, instead of going very, very broad, as Reinhard has done, I will go deep into one aspect of loss and damage where I think the science of attribution can provide some important insights on loss and damage. So whenever extreme events happen nowadays, people immediately ask the question, what's the role of climate change? And actually, usually they don't wait for an answer, but they give the answer for themselves. And sorry, Koko, but so she's gone, that's good. Because people always assume, so the drought in Germany last year is a good example, that people see, oh, this is a drought, there is low water in the Rhine, so this must be climate change. So this is what we will have to deal with in a changing climate. And of course, for a very long time, there was not much evidence to be had when these kind of events were happening. But what scientists were saying was, well, this is sort of the kind of event that you expect to see more of or not in a changing climate, but we can't attribute individual extreme events to climate change. And other people were saying, well, of course, we are living in a world where climate change is happening, so of course climate change is playing a role. And the latter is trivially true, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about what's the role of climate change and how does it affect the event. And then also, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how you need to prepare for the event. And so I would argue that this is quite important because, of course, when we know what the role of climate change is, we can predict climate change to a degree. And we can also predict other drivers, like other natural drivers like land use change or aerosols, and also social drivers. But of course, they play out quite differently in the future. And with attribution science, we are actually able, to a degree, to disentangle these drivers. And when we know where climate change is playing a big role and what this role is, then that will actually help us also to avoid adverse impacts into the future if we know what is it actually that we should prepare for. But of course, this is, so I will just very briefly now give the basic idea about attribution and then go into the details of where it becomes complicated, but where it also might become really useful for loss and damage. So when we talk about attribution, when I talk about attribution, I usually mean event attribution, and I talk about the probabilistic event attribution. And extreme events have always occurred. And all extreme events have multiple causes. And if you absolutely boil down to exactly the individual event, they are unique and they will never occur in exactly the same way again. But what we can, but of course, drivers of extreme event, external drivers to the climate system, can change the likelihood and intensity of extreme events. And that is what we are doing with event attribution. And so this is here just a very simple schematic slide. So we have an extreme event defined by some climate variable, and we decide, okay, everything above this threshold is causing impacts, is causing losses and damages, so this is the extreme event we care about. And we then can say, in the world we live in today, so in the world with climate change, what is possible weather in the world we live in? And we can simulate that using observations and statistical modeling. We can use climate models. Depending on the type of event, there is a variety of tools we can use that allows us to estimate what is possible weather in the world we live in today. And then, after having characterized the extreme event we're interested in, we can then say, okay, everything above this threshold is our extreme event, so we have a likelihood of this extreme event to occur in the world we live in today. And it's a bit, and the reason why there are the dice is that it's like rolling the dice. So if you roll the dice just often enough, you can estimate the likelihood of rolling any type of number just from looking at the eyes on the dot without actually knowing whether or not it's a normal dice or a loaded dice. And because we know how many greenhouse gases we have added into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we can also simulate using statistical models and climate models what would possible weather be in a world that might have been without anthropogenic climate change, because we can remove these additional greenhouse gases from our models' atmospheres. And then in these totally exaggerated schematic, you might then get a very different distribution of possible weather in the world that might have been without climate change. And then if you look then at the likelihood of your extreme event to occur, in this schematic, it's a very different likelihood. And because the only thing that is different between these two worlds is man-made climate change, you can then attribute this difference to anthropogenic climate change and say climate change hence increase the likelihood of this event to occur. So that's the basic idea, which is very straightforward. When you actually do it in the real world, it usually looks more something like this. So this is what we call a return time plot, which if you're a hydrologist, you've seen many of them. If you're not, then you haven't seen them. But it's actually the same thing as I've shown on the schematic before, just plotted in a bit different way. So on the y-axis, we have the magnitude of the event. In this case, it's an extreme rainfall event in the UK. So you have millimeters per day of rainfall. And on this axis, you have the return time. So how often in a given year do you expect this event? How often do you expect this event to happen? And so all these red dots are simulations of possible rainfall in the UK in December in a world we live in today. And the dashed line indicates the extreme events that has occurred. And you can see that in the world we live in today, it's about a 1 in 20 years event. And the blue lines are simulations of possible rainfall in the world that might have been without anthropogenic climate change. And you can see that they are different, but they are not massively different, these two different curves. But you can say, by just comparing, looking at the extreme event in this dashed line, you can say that because of man-made climate change, the likelihood of this event to occur has increased by about 40%. Or, and that might actually maybe be a more useful way of framing the attribution, is that the same event that we have just experienced today with the magnitude of, well, it's 13 millimeters of rain per day or so. The same event would have had 2 millimeters of rain less in a world without climate change. And that doesn't sound much at all, but that can make exactly the difference between whether or not your house is flooded. So even, and it of course crucially depends on your vulnerability, whether these 2 millimeters make a difference or not. But if you're living in the floodplain, 2 millimeters of rain a day, more or less, might be the difference between you get insurance for your house or not in the expectations of the rainfall. So I think it's important to try and not say, oh, this is such a small difference, it doesn't actually matter, but it really crucially depends on who you are, what your vulnerability are, where the thresholds are that matter. And of course, we usually do event attribution once something has happened, because usually people are becoming aware of their vulnerability when something has happened. But of course, it could be that the thresholds that are actually relevant are not necessarily the thresholds that we have observed in the event, but they could be much lower than that, or also maybe a little bit higher. So, so this is the basic idea behind event attribution, and variations of that is what will usually come out of an event attribution study. And Emily has shown this plot before, so this is from Carbon Brief, just a collection of all the event attribution studies that have been done in the last, well, since the science was invented, which is about 190 studies. And when you look at this plot, you see a lot of red, which indicates all these studies where climate change increased the likelihood or intensity of the event. The blue ones are where climate change did not play a big role, and the gray ones are where climate change, well, we don't know. And I think that's very important because a priori, there are 4 possible outcomes of an event attribution study. It could make the event more likely, it could make the event less likely, it could be that the likelihood does not change because of man-made climate change, or it can be that we don't know because we don't have the tools and understanding to actually answer the question for this event. And when you look at this, you might get the impression that climate change is a massive game changer in all our extreme events. But of course, this is absolutely, totally not representative, because these studies are done by the scientists who do event attribution, and that's not that many people in the world, and they live in Europe, they live in Berkeley, they live in Australia, and then there are 1 or 2 individuals that live somewhere else, but everyone else lives in these places, and so they attribute events that are happening in their backyard. And also, there are usually events that make the headlines are events like big heat waves in Europe or hurricanes in the US or so. It's not necessarily events that are happening in other parts of the world and that are maybe also where it's less, where the connection to climate change is less straightforward and also much more complicated to model. So these are also not only is there a selection bias by where people live, but also by what can we model with our climate models quite easily, and heat waves and large-scale rainfall events are the ones that are most easy to simulate in a climate model. And of course, it's also what just gets the attention. And so if there are heat waves in Europe, people talk about it all the time, although it might not be the most dramatic event or the most dramatic impact of climate change, but it's just something that gets a lot of attention. And so, of course, scientists are also joining in that conversation and providing evidence. So I think it is very important when we think about loss and damage that we are trying to be aware that there is a massive bias in what we know, and that we don't use that bias then to design all our mechanisms around loss and damage based on that. So this is sort of the large-scale idea behind event attribution and the studies that have been done. And you can also see from the different symbols the kind of different types of events that have been attributed. But of course, all of these studies, or most of these studies, have been done on meteorological events. So heat waves, rainfall events, and so on. And I now would like to go through some of the key questions that I think we need to ask as a community, and in particular not as a sort of climate science, physical climate science community, but as a larger community in loss and damage, because we need to work together to answer these questions. But I think these are the key questions that we need to address to make attribution relevant for loss and damage. But I think also they are the key questions that we need to ask to do what Koko has asked us to do, to be specific, to not just point conceptual, big picture policy kind of questions, but to actually try and identify what does loss and damage mean on the very local scale, where people are experiencing loss and damage, and also where we need to do something about it. So I think these are, coming from an attribution point of view, these are some of the key questions that we need to address. And the first question is, what losses and damages do actually occur? And so this is a map from the EMDAT, so the disaster database that is put together by the University of Lund in Belgium, where all the natural disasters are captured. So disasters resulting from extreme weather events. There are also disasters from earthquakes and so on, but I've discarded them. And this is looking at, these are the heat waves that have happened since 1985 to 2015. So it's a bit old, this slide, 2015, but actually the picture hasn't changed really in the last few years. And you can see in Europe, there are huge numbers of heat waves where lots of death and people affected were recorded in this database. But when you look at Africa, in most countries, there is not a single heat wave in Africa. And well, when you look at observational data, then that's not really true. There are heat waves happening in Africa, but because the impacts of heat waves are usually not immediately. It's very few people are dropping dead in the street. It's usually that people are admitted to hospital and then die prematurely, and you need a recording system to actually be able to capture these impacts. And if you don't have these recording systems in place, then of course we don't know what the impacts are and what are losses actually from these events to occur. So I think if we really want to understand what loss and damage means, that is one very important aspect of it. And heat waves in Africa is a super obvious place where something with the recording of the losses and damages is obviously going wrong, but there are other places where it's less obvious, but where there are very different ways of how impacts of extreme weather events and therefore impacts of events that can potentially be impacted by climate change interact are are very different, and so our understanding and overview is quite very different. Then the next question is, well, what actually is then, if we, assuming we know that something has happened, that people have died, that people have been affected, that houses have been flooded and so on, what is actually the meteorological event that has led to that? And usually what we when we learn about extreme events, we learn it through something like this, through headlines in the newspaper. And this could be that it's wildfires that are seen as the major impacts of a heat wave. It could be that death of people are the major impacts of heat waves, but it could also be other aspects of a heat wave. And depending on whichever aspect you look at, whichever kind of impact you look at, the meteorological event or the weather event that ultimately is then affected by climate change can be very different. So this is just one example. When you look at, it's the same heat wave we looked at in Serbia. It's quite an old study, but the point is still valid. At the top one, it's the same, it's a heat wave defined by temperature alone. So which might be relevant if you think about agricultural impacts or so on. And you can see that in this one, or you actually, I somehow lost the numbers. This is the 100-year event, this is the 10-year event. So when you look at the plot, you can see that what used to be a 1 in a 100-year event is now a 1 in 10-year event in the world with climate change. And when we look at the same heat wave, but define it at heat stress, so the combination of humidity and temperature, which is what affects the human body, so what's probably most relevant when you think about death, then you still see that climate change had an impact on the likelihood of this event to occur, but it's much smaller. So there is about a doubling in the likelihood of this event to occur. And both ways of looking at heat wave are perfectly valid from a scientific point of view. But of course, what matters and what leads to the losses you care about is very different. And then the next question is, when we are thinking about, and one reason why there is such a bias on attribution studies in Europe and Australia and the US is that that's part of the world that are relatively well observed. But when we do not have observations of weather, then it's very hard to find out what actually is the meteorological event that has happened and that has led to flooding or loss of life. But it's also very difficult to know, well, what we see in our climate models, is that actually reliable? Does that have anything to do with the real world? So this is an extreme example, and where we have tried to answer the question, what's the role of climate change in the frequent droughts we have seen in East Africa? And we looked at very different ways of how you can look at a drought, just the lack of rainfall, but also the soil moisture, a combination of temperature and evaporation and so on. And you can define it in very different ways. And this is using all the models we could get hold of. And you can see, and at the top, all the observations we can get hold of. And this dashed line is that climate change basically is no change. And everything to the right is climate change is making them worse. And everyone to the left is climate change making them less likely. And no matter, depending on how you define it and depending on which models you use and depending on which observational data sets you use, you get very different answers. But the observations that are there in blue are actually not really observations. They are just observations from neighboring countries or from or observations from very large scale indicators fed into a model. So we don't know what happened in reality. So we can't really answer the question in a very satisfactory way of what's the role of climate change in these recent droughts in Africa. The only thing that we can say is, well, we can probably exclude that climate change is an absolute game changer, because then we would see it even in the few observations that we have. But what does that tell us about loss and damage in these areas where vulnerability is particularly high is a question I don't really have an answer to. And then what we can also do is we can disentangle different physical drivers. So greenhouse gases are is one area. So this is again the same time of return time plot, but for extreme rainfall event in Kerala, where the blue line is the world without climate change, the red line is the world with climate change, and you can see there's a very small difference in these two curves. But when we then, and the yellow line here is if we just look at the greenhouse gases from climate change and compare it to the world without climate change. And you can see that there is then suddenly a really big difference in the likelihood of an event like this to occur. So it's not actually probably what is masking the impact of climate change here could be the aerosols in the local aerosols in the air around that. So is actually when what we see in the observations and then the attribution of that, is that actually less than we should expect from climate change? And so there might be masking effects from other drivers that avoid us being able to see what the impacts and losses of climate change today actually are. And so using attribution methodologies allows you to disentangle these different drivers in some ways. And then the last big question is, of course, there is not just the physical world, but what leads to loss and damage is actually to a very large degree driven by vulnerability and exposure. So who is in harm's way and how vulnerable are they? And this is something where we haven't quite, where in the more recent attribution studies that we've done, we always address vulnerability and exposure in a qualitative way. But of course, that is a very different way of looking at data. So I think to really understand loss and damage locally and address it, we need to find frameworks where we can talk about vulnerability and exposure and the changes in the hazard in the same way, so that we can identify, okay, where is the hazard changing and why? So how can we predict that? What's the role? How has vulnerability and exposure changed? How can we predict that so that we can use all this to be prepared for future loss and damage? And so just as my very last, there are lots of difficulties with event attribution, especially in developing countries where loss and damage is actually the most relevant. But there is huge progress. So starting from the 1st of November, the Copernicus, the European Climate Service, is actually piloting operationalizing event attribution so that we will move away from this very patchy scientists just do what's in their backyard attribution to having a more comprehensive and more regular look at extreme events that are affecting, well, that are relevant for Europe, but that is a relatively broad definition. And by doing this, we will get a better understanding of what the impacts of climate change actually are today, which, even if all these other questions are very difficult to answer, can be quite useful in understanding loss and damage.
Brilliant. Thank you, Freddie. Okay, we have time for one question or so. Koko, I think you have a question? We have a...
I would, since I already talked, if there's another question, I'd defer. If not, I'll take it. Thanks so much. First of all, thanks Reinhard and Freddie. Really great presentations. Freddie, a quick question to you. Towards the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned there was a comment about relevant thresholds. Some thresholds are actually lower and some are a little bit higher. So I'm wondering, what insights could you share about what's the relevant threshold? Where are they? And partly that's against the background of these IPCC special reports as well as assessment reports have a framework, reasons for concern. And some of you may know these burning embers. And the burning embers on the y-axis usually have something like temperature, and the variables that you're looking for here are additional than just temperature change, right? So that's really interesting. And then you'll have different reasons for concern. The new special reports are looking beyond the traditional reasons for concern. So for example, singular large disruptive events is a traditional reason for concern. A new reason for concern includes food security. So they're getting more specific in a way. So I'm just wondering, with that background of this reasons for concern, what does your research tell us about where these thresholds are, where risk might change from moderate to more significant, or from important or high risk to very high risk? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I think it's a very difficult question to answer because, of course, it's very. The problem with these reasons for concern is that it collapses everything that's happening very localized with very different vulnerabilities into global overview figures. But I think to answer the simpler part of your question, where you said, what can we learn about where those thresholds are? So, for example, we did an attribution study on the rainfall associated with Hurricane Harvey, where the event was so massive that even if the event would have been half the size it was, actually the damages would be pretty much the same. And that then from that, I think you can then learn something about, okay, we have experienced this event, and we have looked at what's the likelihood of this event to occur. And it's still super rare, even in the world we live in today. But we have, from the damages that we see, we actually see that the adaptation measures would have failed with much lower rainfall as well. And so using that then tells you, okay, this is sort of the type, this is where our vulnerability is really high, and we can then look for the future. How of this threshold, based on this threshold, how is the likelihood changing? And I think that's sort of a much simpler way of what I meant, how we can learn from that. But of course, to translate that then in a global burning ember is again very difficult.
I think we probably have a lot of questions, and we'll continue discussing that. So for sake of time, thank you, Freddie. Fascinating work, as always. And we now have Jonas Åkerman, who's going to, I'll pull up his slides. Applause, yeah. Let me see, skip. Here we go. Here we go. So thank you, Jonas. You're our final speaker today. So here.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for having me here. And I must say, first thing, that I haven't proposed the title, an inspirational talk, because I'm a little bit more humble than that. But I will give you a few examples of what I've experienced during a long period of observations in the field regarding field work in Svalbard, starting 1972 and still continuing. I'm a geocryologist, and I have been studying especially connection between climate and landforms, including also ecological dynamics in a tundra environment. I've been working on these areas, but we will today only focus on the first one, Svalbard. The reason for that I started up here was that up in Svalbard you had the longest climate records of the high Arctic environments that exist. And my supervisor said that go up there and see what you can find about the connection between the climate and some landform processes that he was interested in. I wasn't that very interested. Anyhow, up here we had this long record where we could see the effect of the warming after the Little Ice Age, and then a change of cooling climate during the 30s and up to the 60s. And then I ended up here in the 70s, just before we got this warming that we today call climate change. At that time, it was not at all discussed. So 1972, when I started my fieldwork for my dissertation. Anyhow, we see now that the annual mean temperature up here at Icefield radio station, which I had as my base, has increased tremendously. And actually it is the area, the local area, where the climate has increased the most all over the world. And that goes for the mean annual average temperature. It also goes for the summer temperature. And we have an increase from about 3.5 degrees in July up to over 6 degrees. And that's quite a change that must, one way or the other, be visible in processes and whatever we investigate. So I had a very, very ambitious supervisor. He asked me to do all this baseline geomorphological mapping, etc., etc. I will just go through it very quickly. So they'll see that was really a task that he put on my shoulders. So I ended up here in this area on the west coast of Svalbard, and I got Icefield radio station as my base, where we could go back once a week to have a shower, get some free liquor, and then out again on the 10th. And we chose, apart from, besides the long climatic record, we had a long history of research in this area, Svalbard, with records all back to the mid 1800s, with both Swedes, people from our university here in Lund, and elsewhere in Sweden, and also in international. That meant that we had also a possibility to go even further backwards, even further back than 1912, when the climatic record started. And a lot of other interesting factors that made it easier or relevant to study this area. So I started at Icefield Radio August 1972, and has continued, still or working. This is on August 2019, where we took the last year's readings. And a little bit of showing how I think and how the problems has been during this period. Say, for example, this stone. It has been lying on this beach ridge where we are for 8,200 years. I haven't been studying it that long, but it caught my eyes in 2010. And 2 years later, it looks like this. So, and what has happened? So for 8,200 years, the thermal massage has done nothing to this stone, or it made it ripe so that in 2012 it just ruptured. Or something might have happened, a change in massage, a masseurs with harder hands could have started and the stone broke. Is this something negative, or is that something good? Well, this stone is interesting for some people. The rupture and disintegration here might be of a negative thing for others. But what is happening is that it's fracturing into smaller and smaller pieces and will form soil. And that soil, vegetation can enter and grow in. A stone as such is interesting for anyone, more than it was a very nice stone, isn't this? Anyhow, so studying this process, I should have started 8,200 years and continued every year to see what was going on up till it cracked and fractioned. The same, I actually tried to follow what was going on when it came to a combination of chemical and physical weathering on this dolomite limestone. We choose a number of investigation surfaces, approximately 1.5 square meter large, and we try to follow them each year, how much matter or fractions were produced every year. And a little bit happened, but after 22 years, we could not find any correlation whatsoever with climate. So we gave up. But then, after another year, a couple of years, suddenly a big slab, you see the blue arrow here, just broke loss. It was outside the investigation plot, so it was a new use to our records. We couldn't use it anyhow, but it was interesting. But it gives you an idea how 3-year projects of how worthless they may be. So, going back to history, 1972 to 2009, you see a lot of things change. Numerous changes were observed. Many of them were connected to climate. But what about damages and losses? I haven't been looking at it in these terms. I might be using the completely wrong terminology here in this context. But let's see. I would just take some examples. Change number 1, sea ice. As this station is situated along the coast, we also had a task to map what was going on along the coastline. So it was coastal geomorphology. So when I started up there in the Gullardales, you met the pack ice already a couple of hours north of Norway. And then when you come up to Svalbard, the west coast was completely covered with sea ice, and the fjords were completely packed with ice, like this. So getting ashore was a hassle, a damn hassle for normal people. Not for this guy who went out in his Gucci slippers and moved the ice flows away so that we could get ashore. But then in the, say, mid-80s, suddenly we got a change. No more sea ice along the west coast. All the fjords were sea ice, like any other typical Norwegian fjord, which are ice-free all the year round. And that meant something for the coastal geomorphology. So within this 50 kilometers large investigation area, I had a number of rivers that entered the sea. And all these rivers that entered the sea as any proper river should do. But then suddenly, starting in the, yes, as I said, mid-80s, beginning of the 90s, started to get blocked by huge beach ridges being formed during the winter because there was no ice breaking the waves. So the big beach ridges were formed. And that continued year by year. And some of the rivers changed their outlet and their stream pattern. But the most important thing that happened was that during snowmelt, all the wetlands inland from the shore got flooded. And that meant that the active layer got deeper and we got a methane emission from the area. But that has not, I have not studied that at all. But we studied the flow in the rivers. You have in the upper graph, you have the normal flow of the river, and then in the lower you have the new flow. Nothing, and then flush out with all the water in 2 or 3 days. And as we should have something fun to do apart from all the geomorphology, we also study the bird life in the area. So we checked the wetland birds breeding within the catchment area there. You have the species here. And we saw that this flooding and the flush flow in the rivers took place during the most critical period of these birds' breeding period. And during flooding years, between 20 and 100% of the nests were destroyed. So almost, if you take an average, more than 50% of the species breeding within this catchment area, they failed with their breeding. And I then constructed this sequence of events: changing climate, warmer climate in the Arctic, less sea ice, unprotected shores during the winter storms, higher and cemented storm ridges, blocked river outlets, rising rivers and lake levels and flooding, inundated bogs near the lakes and the ponds, animals, drainage patterns, and breeding and flowering failures in the catchment. So this is a very simple, straightforward sequence, but from the global to the individual. And then the loss of sea ice meant that these guys could enter the fjords and we could get an increased tourism. So, and every one of these big ships bring 3,000 to 5,000 tourists ashore. And as long as I get ashore in Longyearbyen, the main city up there, the tourism thrives and the business is going very well. But we know that there are problems involved. For example, this ship, perhaps you recognize it. It travels so very close to the shore here, just outside Kaplinge, that no fishing trawler or our rubber boats would go that close to the shore. And this is the one, huh? The same ship, 2 weeks later. No, this was not on Svalbard, as you know. It was down on the Mediterranean. But the problems are the same. If it happens up there, it will be a hell of a problem. There are alternatives, of course. Very nice such alternatives. But never the same, there are 30,000 tourists a year coming to Svalbard. And they do leave footprints. Not big as dinosaur footprints. This is, of course, not the dinosaur footprints. But this is. They are within my investigation area. It's a dinosaur like this one, Icanogon. And it's positioned in this rock wall here, or it was. But it is lost forever. It's gone. The Norwegians blame the Russians up there that they have been taking it away, stealing it. But it could be natural process, who knows. But it's more fun in this context to say that they were stolen by Russian tourists. We have another thing that connects to this. The polar poppy that we have up here. In 1924, in a report, this flower was only found around Kaplinge at one place. In 1974, we found it on 10 places. 94, I had 2 girls making their masters, and they found it like this. And in 2014, we had a doctor's course up here. They found it like this. And you see the pattern. It all focus on the radio station, which now is a hotel. So it's the footprints that has helped this flower to spread. And today it looks like this. It's spread all over. It's not an invasive. It's a native flower that makes probably no damage, or it makes no loss, but we don't know if it is a loss or a damage yet. But something is happening at the least. Also, the ice, the changes in sea ice, makes more polar bears to get ashore, and they are very hungry and dirty. That means that when we're having courses up there and doing field work, we need to be aware. But according to research on polar bears, the polar bear population is only locally disturbed. Most of the polar bears, they will adjust sooner or later to the new situation. That is at least what they say. In this context, we also have winners. And the whales have come back. They were completely gone, almost all the whales, even the big whales. I didn't have any good pictures of them, so I've taken myself. The white whales has always been there, but there are more now. But also all the big whales are back in the fjords, hundreds of them. And the walrus is coming back. It's also all over. So there are winners and losers. Change number 2, winter precipitation. It has increased tremendously. And both when it comes to snow precipitation, that causes trouble in Longyearbyen, not within my investigation there. So I will only summarize that you have damages and losses to person properties, and we have death. That depends on the increased winter precipitation. The winter precipitation is also important to the Svalbard reindeer. These are very tough creatures. They are used to sustain the winter because they eat themselves fat during the summer, and then there are no problems for them to live on the dry grass during winter time, if you don't get winter rains. But that we get very much more frequently now. So all areas are getting glazed by ice. So the reindeers, they suffer. And we did some simple investigation that we could see that the populations within an area dropped very, very clearly after winter rains. That means that it is a damage to the reindeer population, but so far it's not a big problem and not a loss. But it is another problem for the reindeer, who has a lot of problems up there. It's a plus for the polar bear, get an alternative to the manure shore. We have another guy, the muskox. They're already extinct. A big mammal like this, extinct. The last one died already in 1982, so it's difficult to say whether we have a really connection to climate change or not. Anyhow, 72 and 75, we had them as pets around the station and during my field work. But their population went down, and in 82, the last one, as I said, died. And that is definitely a severe loss. Change number 3, permafrost and active layer. You know that you have a huge distribution of permafrost all the northern hemisphere, 50% of the land surface approximately. And the active layer is a very simple and very straightforward thing to investigate. Let me see. Oh, how do you do it? Come on. Anyhow, with the probe, you're just taking the depth of how much is thawing have been thawed during the summer. And here we are digging ourselves down to it. The active layer is the thawed layer above, and here we have the permafrost table, the yellow dotted line here. And the depth of this active layer is a measure of all energy has come in during the summer. So if you can follow that year by year, you will get a very good measure of what's going on. And we have a number of sites where we have been following the active layer in 100 meter by 100 meter squares. And here you have a summary of the measurements from 72 to this year. You have the yellow dots are the summer climate, and the red bars are the depths of the active layer. So in the box where this measurement are from, we had initially 15 to 22 plant species on every square 10 meters, and the surface was a sink for carbon dioxide. But from now, when you have got a very deep active layer, you will get a lot of water standing and a lot of turbulence, cryoturbation, and you have got to change into 2-3 species per 10 meter, and we get a clear carbon dioxide and methane source emitted to the atmosphere. colleagues of mine are measuring this, and we'll get more accurate data on that. You can follow it. So this is definitely a damage and a loss for the globe, because huge areas have deepening active layers with increased emissions of these greenhouse gases. Another thing that is connected to the deepening active layer is that lakes disappear at the end of summer. They didn't before. So lakes that look like this, very shallow lakes, but still, with the deepening active layer, they are getting completely drained in September. And that is, of course, not a big deal, but the bottom of these lakes is very, very rich on organic matter. And that organic matter contains all goodies that are being released as both phytoplankton and zooplankton during the spring period, when all the young chicks are coming to these water bodies to have their first 2 weeks of food. Now they're gone. We have other changes. Change number 4, changes to IceFlow radio. That radio station was the communication center between Norway and Svalbard in the old days. Gradually it has been automatized, so now there is a cable from Norway connecting directly to the Longyearbyen center. And that meant that the good old days with a crew that stayed there 9 months without any supply whatsoever, because there was no connection with ship during winter time. All these good parties that we had, they were all gone. And now when we come up there, now it has been turned into a hotel. So what was before a radio station with 7 guys, it's now a hotel. And that has been the reason for this station surviving. So it's now a possibility for people to come there and to learn about this very nice environment. So in this sitting room here is now dining room. So is this a damage or loss? Yeah, you can joke a little bit. And it's just to be old and just time to enjoy and the service and the comfort that the station now offers. But apart from that, the area still have all the very nice surroundings with not so many footprints. And there's so much more to do and to connect to the studies that we have been doing for so long time. So thanks for listening. Hope to see you up there.
So we have a few minutes for any final questions to Jonas or any of the other panelists before we break for lunch, a well-deserved lunch, I think. Any questions from the ecologists amongst us? Let you think for a minute. Thank you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was wondering how it feels going up to Svalbard now with these changes that you see from a scientific perspective, but also as a person who's been living there or being there over the last 40 years.
It's of course very, very mixed feelings, but the possibility to run courses up there now with this very nice infrastructure that has been developed is absolutely something that I really love, to be able to help in transferring the knowledge and introducing new students to this area and to these problems. So mixed feelings, but I'm very happy, and I'm very happy with the comfort that is up there now.
Thank you very much for that. Me working with agriculture, these are very highly anthropogenically affected areas, or I can imagine also urban areas. It's a similar problem, whereas this is pretty natural, not so anthropogenically affected, at least not locally. So would you recommend to set up monitoring sites that can help the global community inform on quick and slow changes? Because these kind of long track records are so valuable. But how do we do it, and who should maybe support that kind of monitoring for the benefit of a global good?
The first thing is to see to that the Norwegian Meteorological Institute can continue to have their automatic station running at least. And then we have the university studies in Svalbard, UNIS. They're running projects out there, following in my footsteps, so to say. They're doing modern measurements of permafrost temperature down to 7 meters depth with modern loggers, etc. So they have very good connections to what we are doing with these very simple things. And the active layer measurements that we started that very early, they are within a Northern Hemisphere network called something. Administrated by the International Permafrost Association. So we have our data in that system. And the UNIS people or researchers, they have also their areas where they monitor with the same method inside Longyearbyen. And there is also measurements in Jonas and the other center for research up in Svalbard. So I think that, and together with UNIS and together with Norwegian Polar Institute, and together with the Norwegian government, who are very, very keen on keeping research going on and to have their flag flying up there, I think that there is all the best already in place to keep things going.
Yeah, we have a question from Richard in the audience.
Thank you. Just on the ecology perspective, since we're asking about that. The winners and losers that you mentioned, this seems to be a dominant theme in ecological research in general. Yeah. There's species turnover as some species become maladapted and some more adapted to their local conditions. But there's also an argument that some of the winners that we see, this is more to do with species interactions, and that so in the case of predators, they benefit from the maladaptation of the prey. So some of your predators there with the caribou. The danger of that is we could be a little bit less worried that this is just a natural process. Some win, some lose, but some of the winners that we're seeing, maybe this is just a temporary win and that the system's in flux. And what we're looking at here is they benefit in the short term only to find themselves come unstuck in the long term. What is your feeling from your perspective on Svalbard?
My feeling from the area that we have been studying a little bit is that some of the wetland birds has been temporarily, I think, because there are other areas where they very easily can move. So I would think that they will learn, or their next generations, they will find better solutions for finding their place to put their nest at the early. But the problem is that you don't see the problem until it's too late. So, and the real losers that we have seen, that's the eider duck. That normally before the change from the radio station to a hotel is we had about 80 pairs nesting around the station. This year we had 0. And that is probably partly by disturbance, partly by the chicks that don't have these small water ponds to go to when they are hatching, and to stay there for a week or two before they go out into the sea. And partly also that the guys who before stayed at the station, that didn't care damn about laws and regulations. So they shot the polar bear, not the polar bear, the polar fox. Whenever the polar fox came to steal eggs, they shot him. And when the skua came to steal eggs, they were shot. And when the big polar glaucous gull came, they were shot. Today, they're protected. Nobody dares to scare them. And that also affects. And that is a part of the dynamic, I would say. So there are winners, there are losers. And being a geomorphologist, I have only studied some of the flowers and some of the birds, etc., as something that do besides every other thing. So I'm not a specialist in it at all.
We had one more question and then one question at the front.
I was just wondering whether you felt the pace of change that you've been witnessing is quicker or slower than has been predicted from models, both geophysical and biological. And if you feel that it's more rapid, why would you think that's the case?
So the trend, if you only take one example, you say the active layer, it has followed the summer temperature or the annual temperature, whatever you compare it with, very, very well, and it has gone down deeper and deeper and deeper, but then it has been leveled out. So now, even if you have a colder summer or a warmer summer, you don't see any change anymore because they were now so deep down. So there is some kind of balance. But the problem is that when you have passed in the wetland areas, where you pass the peat layer and get into the mineral soil, you will start to get cryotubation. That means that the peat are mixed into the mineral soil, and the peat is being oxidized, and you will get carbon dioxide from it. And that is the main thing, that you will get a complete change of the land surface from a vegetated area with a turf isolating cover now to a mineral soil area with pattern ground formation. Was that an answer?
One more question, I think, from Leonard.
Okay, another profound change, which I would like you to hear your comment on. About 15 years ago, Spencer Wert wrote a book, The Discovery of Climate Change. And there he said that before climate change became a popular topic, climatology was so boring that the only place you could find it was in the attic of a geography department. I suppose it has changed. And to what extent sort of has the geographers been able to keep up with this?
Because they changed over with modern equipment to study the greenhouse gases. So I would say that other departments are to 75% are dealing with greenhouse gases and monitoring greenhouse gases in various environments, including Svalbard. But people like me studying what's going on the ground with the fauna or the flora are very, very scarce.
Yeah.
So we are more or less instinct as well. Soon.
Thank you, Jonas. So I think I've been told to wrap up because there's another booking at 1:15 and we're going over our time. But I just wanted to just sort of wrap up that we had, in a way, we ended here with a story from one of our elders in the community with a knowledge, local knowledge and perspective that can help us to ground us in thinking about losses and damages, what they mean in places and to people and to the wider landscape. We also have stories about the modern science of attribution and how we can connect events to emissions, which opens up exciting new things in terms of social mobilization and society engaging, responsibility and so on. And we have this perspectives on, or stories about risk and how risk comes in and how transformations can be linked to risk in new ways. There's something to unpack there. And then we have the policy story and the policy realm of another epistemic community, which is at the forefront of making decisions and pushing forward action, finance, opportunities, and also constraints in some regards as well, feeding back to the knowledges amongst all of you here. And I think it's fascinating and exciting and challenging in many ways. And Now I think we should turn our attention to the lunch and feed our bellies. And continue at 1 o'clock up at Josefsson, which is up the road, not about 5 minutes from here. We can all sort of follow one another, where we kick off our session headed by Rachel James on what's new about climate change and loss and damage. So thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you. Thank you.